Welcome to the Messy City Podcast, where we talk with the people who design, plan, build, develop, or even just think about how to create beautiful, successful, and humane cities and towns. Let's learn from each other and create places we truly care about. Welcome back to the Messy City Podcast. This is Kevin Klinkenberg. Today I'm joined by Mr. Optimism, Kobe Lefkowitz, who I'm really delighted to have on the program today. Kobe and I had a chance to meet a few weeks ago when he was here in Kansas City and hoped to record a podcast then. We just kind of ran out of time. Kobe, it's great to have you on the show.
Kevin, such a pleasure to be here, man. I've been a longtime listener and fan of your work, as you well know, and it was a real pleasure for me to get to meet you in person, hear a little bit about Kansas City, and now dive into a lot of fun stuff, and all things urbanism, development, and beyond.
Yeah, it was a lot of fun, and it was an interesting night because you actually had a heckler.
I did.
Have you had hecklers before at your presentations?
This was probably the most forceful. It was very exciting, I thought. But
I have to say, you kept your composure very well.
Well, afterwards, a couple of folks came up and said, well, we were really nervous for you. And I said, well, it hadn't even passed my mind. I would say new to inspiring passions of people in the discourse of city building. But this is the first time that someone almost took the stage.
Well, it was funny because my friend Abby, who you met, and I were joking too that the guy was obviously an architect because, you know, speaking as an architect myself, I know I have a lot of architect friends who get a little crazy at talking about beauty and stuff like that.
We all do.
Yeah. Anyway, it was a lot of fun. Kobe has a book out called Building Optimism: Why Our World Looks the Way It Does and How to Make It Better. He has a Substack by the same name, Building Optimism. I guess the first thing I'd ask is, Kobe, did you see the study that came out recently that people who are optimistic actually live longer?
I didn't, but now I will be telling everyone that and that they need to go read my book. And it's actually medically advised that they do so.
It actually was a really fascinating study, controlling for all these different variables and everything else. They found that people who had a disposition to be more optimistic lived longer lives. So,
well, if we break it down for a second, it does make sense to me because optimism is a motivating force, and if there is something that gets you out of the bed in the morning and gets you out of your apartment and maybe a little bit, I don't want to say morbidly, but if there were something wrong with you, you would feel compelled to do something about it, to take that charge on. And if you are dismotivated and you sort of let cynicism wash over you, it can have the inverse effect. And I guess if you stack on enough of those instances over the course of one's life, it completely makes sense to me that an optimistic life can, in aggregate, be a longer one.
So we'll get more into the development and architecture discussion, but I'm curious, do you feel like you've kind of always had that disposition of being a pretty optimistic person?
Certainly in the built environment, I was always fascinated with buildings, and growing up in New York, my first notions really of buildings were the excitement of skyscrapers growing up. So I grew up just outside of the city, though my family's from the city, spent most of my life in and around the city. And the town that I grew up next to, I went to school in a different jurisdiction, but my downtown a mile away from my house is called White Plains. Mm-hmm. And from my window, I could see the skyscrapers going up in downtown White Plains. And I thought it was so cool. Yeah. And from there, which is strange now, it's such at odds with what I practice and preach professionally. My great fascination was of Dubai and of new cities being built outside of Beijing and in Malaysia. These were these fascinating projects. And someone who's 12, 13, and 14, just getting to know about the world of architecture, design, and development, the awe-inspiring projects certainly do awe
Yeah.
in in their scale. And I thought it would be so cool to do something like that. So from a very early age, I was very hopeful about my ability to impact the world around me
Yeah.
because it was what inspired me from that early
Well, there's
age.
probably a little bit of George Bailey in all of us. We want to do big things and build impressive things. I think I remember even when I was a kid. It's funny because you're right. We've both probably ended up down paths that where the things that we actually want to design and build are really different. But when I was a kid, I used to have these sketches I would do of fantastic futuristic cities with dome stadiums and freeways going everywhere and skyscrapers. Because that was just that was the vision of the time. That was kind of fun to play with.
Absolutely. I wish I could say it had as deft of a hand as you. And that's why I'm not an architect by training, even though I went to architecture school, is because I couldn't reproduce those grand images by hand. I could curate them and look at articles and social media posts and take pictures, certainly, of what I liked. But I wasn't the kid who was spending every single day drawing because even to this day, it looks like stick figures and houses that you would put on your fridge when you were 5.
Well, getting through architecture school was easier for some, harder for others. It was probably on the harder side for me. But it's like anything. You develop a muscle and you keep working it and you get better at it. So let's do backup. I want to talk a little bit about where you came from and your own professional journey to get to where you are now. You grew up outside New York City, obviously had a fascination with cities and building. And where did that lead you down your path?
So I originally did think I wanted to be an architect, despite what I just said. I have this funny story that even at the time I thought it was funny. I really cared about school. I cared about my grades. And one of my worst classes in high school was architecture. But I was so happy about getting a C. I felt so fulfilled that I had spent the semester or the term creating something with my hands after designing it in CAD. So we first half of the year we worked in CAD, and the second half was creating a model based off of that. And it was really a terrible building. I mean, it looked awful. I remember spending hours over the door schedules, just trying to get the door to swing the right way and understanding why it went inwards or outwards. But I loved it. And I thought from that moment, okay, this means I want to be an architect. And after that experience, I took a couple of other classes and figured it really wasn't for me. And I learned, well, I can get rather close to this without being an architect. And that means being a developer. So I can guide some of the design process without actually having to replicate it by hand. And that was exciting for me.
At what point were you aware of the idea of developers and like what a developer did?
Well, it sounds precocious to say now, but I would say going into high school, 8th grade, specifically, I remember 8th grade summer, I stumbled upon a couple of articles in whether it was the New York Times or the New York Post, the local papers, and always being fascinated by the real estate section, the new projects that are being created. And you read about all of these big names. Obviously, there are certain individuals that have risen to some level of prominence in the New York development scene in recent years. But there was always a glamour about the real estate families in the city and the large developers. So I think there was an opportunity for a young New Yorker to be more conscious of this than perhaps in other cities because the real estate section was treated more like a tabloid. So it was a little more accessible than a trade publication. So I was aware from an earlier age, even though my family wasn't in real estate, which is a very rare thing in New York to get into it without having family connections. And even my friends' parents and families around us, no one in my extended family really, save an uncle, were in real estate. So it was a strange thing. And my mom and dad were always great about encouraging whatever each of us, my siblings, enjoyed. And they didn't know much about it either, but we'd drive by construction sites. I'd point and say, oh, look at that building. And they would, satisfy that curiosity.
Mhm.
So it was great.
And so then from there, when you went off to college, what did you actually study?
So I started at NYU. I played basketball there, and I was actually in the real estate development school. It was the second year the program Shack existed. So we were the second matriculating class. And a couple of injuries, one thing led to another, and I ended up transferring down to Virginia. I love NYU. I'm now a faculty member at NYU Shack, so there's no love lost. But I was born and raised in the city, going to school in the city, had some health complications, and I felt if I can get out of the city, I've got to experience it, right? My brother was down at Virginia and thought it was a really beautiful school, Jefferson's grounds, of course. Thought about maybe going into the commerce school, which would be more economics oriented, but it's probably the pathway that developers would traditionally go down. But again, was always fascinated by architecture and design. And I felt that NYU didn't have an architecture program. There were some cross listings at Cooper Union or other schools in the city, maybe at Pratt, but it really wasn't as strong of a discipline as you would expect for a university as big as NYU. So it was very exciting for me to the prospect of going into architecture school. And once I got into Virginia, I figured I'm going to go down this pathway because you can always learn the numbers, but you can't learn design. You have to be immersed into it. You have to spend those long days in the studio replicating something by hand or by reference, reading as many articles, watching interviews, documentaries, etc., spending a great deal of time in the library. After having taken all the core studios, I was validated for a second time in my life. Architecture isn't for me, but I really fell in love with urban planning. There's something about the comprehensive nature of understanding urban governance, politics, economics, design, community formation, all wrapped into one that really appealed to me. And that's the pathway I ultimately went down.
Interesting. What was the culture shock like going from New York to Charlottesville, Virginia?
It was a culture shock. I joke with people to this day that they sequestered the architecture school students off on one part of the campus. We weren't even on the formal grounds, right? We were shoved away. And it was the most international school at Virginia, which had always attracted to me. I went to public school, but my public school was very international, just outside of the city. And I had a lot of friends who had grown up in different parts of the world. So I felt comfort there at Virginia. But I'm a New Yorker, so I often wore blacks or dark blues. That's our outfit de rigueur. And people would always come up to me and say, you know, I thought you were really standoffish when I saw you around grounds, but you're actually really welcoming and nice. I go, why would you think that? And I'm like, well, you wear all black and no one here wears that. You know, we wear the girls and pearls, guys and ties, the pastel.
Seersucker.
Seersucker, exactly. So that was as much of a culture shock as anything else. And probably to the inverse, they thought, who's this weird New Yorker come down to the South? Yeah. But I love Charlottesville. I think it was really important to go there because I was forced to reconcile with this world of skyscrapers and scale and mass density that you're exposed to in New York with the human scale of being in a historic city that is a really wonderful place to live. And a lot of families move down from DC to raise their children there because it's such a wonderful place. So I found a way to reconcile the scale of New York with sort of the humanity of a place like Charlottesville. And that's a lot of what I try to do through this day.
Yeah. It's one of the really great college towns in the country. Beautiful place. And actually has one of the few pedestrian malls that has survived and works really well.
So it's really interesting you say this. I believe there's only two others that still exist from the 1970s era of pedestrian malls. That would be Burlington in Vermont and Boulder in Colorado. There may be a couple of others, but these are the three most famous. And this was one of my first tangible lessons in urban planning. Why have these places remained so successful while many hundreds of others that were created in this sort of postmodernist backlash to mid-century planning failures, it's not just that they're next to universities, so Vermont, Virginia, and Colorado, but it's the fact that they have sufficient density to support the retail programming, which a lot of these malls forgot. They said, we're going to copy the form without understanding the fabric. And it was a really important lesson that you can't just rely on the aesthetics or archetypal form of a structure, which may be good prima facie. You have to understand all the context that surrounds it as well.
Yeah. I mean, if you don't really have, speaking from more from an economic standpoint, if you don't have like a captured population close enough to support it or a market, then you don't have the density to do it. It's just not going to work. And it's just, part of that's the uniqueness of American retailing and how people come to support various businesses, why businesses survive and don't survive. I mean, we could go down a whole rabbit hole about pedestrian spaces. I probably don't want to take you there, but so anyway, so you got an urban planning degree then from UVA, and then
that's right.
At what point did that kind of lead you into the development world?
So also strangely, I knew I wanted to get back into development. I didn't think seriously about going into public or private planning practice because while I had a design education, I was not good enough to be a design professional. And I was very aware of that. And I also thought that the way that I could probably best influence the built environment was being a developer, sort of changing the projects that, or the type of projects that were being built even marginally to offer an opportunity for something that's a little bit different. So I went and worked at this institutional REIT in DC doing, the people I worked with were wonderful, but it wasn't exactly the type of work that would inspire a young graduate of architecture school. And shortly after, came back up here to New York and worked for a really wonderful infill development firm, very design forward. Every year they're on AD, top 100 designers in the world. So it's a really cool environment. And that was as much of a culture shock as me going from New York to Virginia was going from this institutional buttoned up shop to the cool kids in Brooklyn where, every day you're playing 70s Bollywood remixes on the speakers in the office. And the lunch conversations are why burgundy may not be the color of the season, but maroon, it looks like there's going to be some momentum behind it. So it was really wonderful where most of the folks who worked at our firm, and to this day, it's called Ash NYC. Well, now it's rebranded as Ash World, were designers or creatives, a lot of interior designers, a lot of stagers. Our real estate team was relatively small, but we all had urban planning and architecture backgrounds on the real estate team. So the sorts of projects that we took on were all urbanistically forward. They were mixed use. They were infill. They were proximate to transit. We did a lot of work in Brooklyn and then expanded as the company moved more into hospitality to cities like Providence, New Orleans, Detroit, Richmond, a little bit in Philly. And now the company has gone from strength to strength. So it was a really wonderful environment to be in and a lot closer philosophically to where I am, I like to work. So it was great. And John and Ari Heckman and John Minkoff are the guys who run Ash. They were just wonderful. They gave me every opportunity to do whatever I reached out for, basically. So it was a real crash course when I was 23, 24 in what a proper real estate development firm looks like. And I could wear as many hats as I saw fit. So it probably accelerated my career some years by having that freedom.
Yeah. I mean, that sounds like an ideal scenario, especially in a smaller shop to start out with. So let's talk about like the day-to-day a little bit of that. I think a lot of people may not understand when you say you go work for a company like that, What are you doing? Like, what's your day-to-day like? Are you essentially doing project management and execution?
So I didn't do as much project management at the beginning because I was a young guy who hadn't done
Yeah,
project management.
sure,
So
sure.
you're working on a 30, $50 million project. You don't want the 23-year-old kid with a hard hat on the site, especially in New York. Those guys aren't going to take you too seriously.
Yeah.
And I don't really have the sort of disposition that a foreman in Bed-Stuy is going to necessarily listen to. I'm much more easy come, easy go. So when I started, it was a little bit more acquisitions, a little bit more asset management, investor relations, and then moving into project management. So what does that mean? A lot of people that I talk to want to get in development, hear all these words thrown around, and it's rather abstract to them. So I'll sort of take it from the top of the funnel. Acquisitions, we're just looking for properties to buy. So that could be a vacant plot of land, or as was the case at Ash, we use historic tax credits where we would leverage them to revitalize historic structures. And those deals are a little bit more complicated, but we have a set of criteria that we look for neighborhoods we really like. They had to have been urbanistically sound, close to transit. There's sort of this ineffable cool factor with a lot of them. And you really only understand that by going around and walking in the neighborhood or spending a lot of soft qualitative research time. Real estate famously has 3 rules, as we all know. And so if you get the location right, and then the location right, and then the location right, you basically get 80% of the job done. But how do you lock in that last 20%? You have to create an offering that's sufficiently compelling. And so in a lot of our underwriting process, which is what you would call the financial modeling of understanding whether a given acquisition will make financial sense, was taking into consideration the quality of the assets in a neighborhood for a given asset class. So it could be a hotel, it could be an office, multifamily apartment building, et cetera. How we would be positioned against them and what we could do to differentiate ourselves from those. And that starts the first day you look at a site. And you say, our vision is of a 5-story building with a really curated and eclectic mix of retail tenants that are going to be in 400 square foot bays as opposed to 3,000 square foot bays, because we believe that breaking down the size of a retail unit will create more traction on the street. It'll be a lower hurdle for the tenants to pass for rent needs and merchandising needs, et cetera, et cetera. So that's the top of the funnel. You do acquisitions. Then you go through the process to buy the land and develop it. So this gets into the project management. And obviously there are a lot of stages in between. We weren't an architecture firm, so we're not doing the conceptual design, schematic design, DD and CDs, but we're overseeing that process. So looking back and forth the documents, redlining, saying, we don't think the bathroom, the wet wall should be here. We think it should move 3 feet in the other direction. Getting those plans to the city. And then ultimately, when it's ready to come out of the ground, being on site several days a week, every day of the week, staying on the contractors and the subs to make sure that it's built according to plans and famously on time and on budget, which is a lot easier said than done. Maybe I'll take a beat there, but that was sort of the front end of a lot of what we did.
Interesting. So I would imagine that in that scenario, especially as a young person, you're spending a lot of time on the phone, a lot of time out, meeting and talking to as many people as you could. Just a lot of time pressing the flesh to understand what options there are for you.
Yeah, that's right. Though I think even from that age, what made me a little different is that I did not like dialing for dollars. And maybe nobody does when you're young. You hear no a lot, and that's certainly something you have to become used to. But I would go to a given neighborhood and I would just walk it, understand every single block, know that there's a really cool new Korean ceramic store that's opening up. And it's different than the antique Korean ceramic store 3 neighborhoods away that nobody really finds interesting, because this one has a courtyard and they have a DJ who comes on Tuesday nights and they have orange wine nights. right? Like
Right.
there's softer things that you only get from walking around a neighborhood.
Yeah.
And so there was this integral peripatetic nature to development that I unfortunately think has been lost with a lot of the institutionalization of development, because you basically just have a buy box. You say, I'm looking for cities whose demographic growth is X, who have median incomes of Y, and that are proximate to within a 15-minute drive of these job centers. And the location actually doesn't matter in that sort of development, because you're not worried about being a part of a broader fabric that you might contribute to, and that in the inverse might raise your own valuation. You are just an island. And if I can build a 300 unit apartment building with a fitness center, a pool, and maybe a grocery store on the ground floor, why do you ever need to leave? Right. And so that is a job that is very different qualitatively than what we did. And I'm glad for it. There's obviously a place in the market for this, but unfortunately, most development has become rather rote in that way I just described.
Yeah, I think it kind of reminds me of the discussion we've had before about sort of the difference between small development and large scale development, and what our friend Monty Anderson would describe as finding your farm. And like that's the real differentiator of value for a smaller or mid-sized developer, is like knowing a place and really being very intimately knowledgeable about everything going on in that place. And I think what you describe is, even in a really big city like New York City, that's really a great approach, is you can dial into a certain area and just know it better than anybody else. So that's really cool. All right. So at what point then did you go on and start looking at trying to say, I want to do some of my own projects and lead my own, create my own thing?
Yeah, I think when you're young and in the world of development, you always want to do your own deals. And I was anxious to do that. It wasn't necessarily the best decision at the time. In retrospect, we can look back and say, oh, it's all worked out. But I worked at Ash for almost 3 years, 2.5 years, and was introduced to a guy who's now my partner, who had a couple of plots of land in Southern California, in San Diego specifically, that him and his family had bought, and they wanted to develop them. And we started having weekly calls, and then a couple times a week, and then every day. And it sort of organically moved into us working on these first few deals. So I was, I think, maybe 25 when we started doing that. And I say it was maybe not the best decision because I didn't have a ton of money saved up. New York City is very expensive. So I moved back home for a couple of years. All the savings that I had, which were meager at that point, went into these first couple projects. And development, especially in California, is a 2 to 4 year cycle, even for infill projects. So if you're doing a small project, and the way developers make money is on fees, it's a proportion of the total cost of a project, and you've got a partner, or maybe even two partners, doing $1 million deal, that might sound like very exciting if you're younger, but that means you're getting 2 to 3% on $1 million paid over 2 years, split 3 ways. So when you do make money, you make about $3,000, which is just not enough to live on. And we didn't, basically. We were fortunate enough to be able to live at home, and through experience, then go do another deal and the third deal. So that was invaluable for us, because it's you then build up a track record that investors and lenders are willing to stand behind, but they're not for 3 or 4 years. So it was a really steep learning curve, and ultimately made sense for me, and I was able to sustain that. But I don't know that I would advise it for other young developers, just because California is a fabulously difficult place to develop, and the life of a developer is uncertain. You take a lot of risk, and obviously there's upside to this, but the reality that I don't think is talked about as much is when you're delayed by 3 months because the utility agency just decides not to send somebody out to the site. And there's a snowstorm or a monsoon unexpectedly, and your lease up season pushes back 3 months. Now you have 6 extra months of interest payments before you can get your property listed for sale. And if macro trends change in a wrong direction and interest rates rise and no one wants to buy the house, or that we built townhouses to start, now you're accruing a lot of interest. And to the extent that you had any profit margin, which is really, really thin on these sorts of projects, it's basically all gone.
Yeah.
So you feel that in an intimate way. And that was basically our experience for some years.
Yeah. I mean, I feel that exactly. We've got this project that we started in 2021, which is a mixture of townhouses and apartments. And in 2021, everything was just flying off the shelves. If you had a property to list for sale, it was sold within, a few days, as interest rates were so low, in large part, and there was such demand for housing. And then, you fast forward like 3 years to now we've got these townhomes that are complete and for sale, and the entire housing market is different. And it's very slow. And so, there's a lot of things that can change in the course of a project. So.
Absolutely. And it brings back to my mind the point of optimism, because if you don't have this belief that things will change around when the market is improving, or that you can sell a given product, whether it's a townhouse or rent another, if it's an apartment or retail or whatever the asset class might be, then you won't start in the first place. Right. Because if you take a calculated assessment of all of the risks, very few rational actors would do this. So you need to have something that motivates you beyond the cold calculus of a financial model. Yeah. And I think it is that softer spirit of a hope for creating a better world. Because if you wanted to just go make money in a financial asset, there are a lot better ways to do it than being a small scale developer.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's probably a good segue to talk a little bit about then how you got involved with writing. I remember I first came across you on Twitter/X with prolific posting of beautiful pictures of architecture and places, and really sharing sort of a positive view about, hey, this is beautiful stuff. And by the way, we can build beautiful things. We don't have to accept ugliness. And so what sort of started your foray into that, and then eventually writing a book?
Loneliness. So it's funny. I was just talking about this with somebody last week, and I felt extraordinary cognitive dissonance. She said, "Oh, I know all these people who are interested in urban planning and in the built environment." And I was like, that just wasn't the case a decade ago when I first got into this. And I remember very clearly asking my friends who were planners in school and then just after school, you don't understand single family zoning. We have to reform it. Or road widths. Like, wouldn't it be amazing if we could take Marcus Garvey in Harlem and go from 100 feet wide, build housing down the middle, and just change transportation policy? And they go, yeah, whatever, let's go to the bar. And I'm like, I don't drink. I want to talk about planning. And so I annoyed enough of my friends and family members. And I had all of these thoughts that, on these walks throughout cities, whether for work or that's just what I do for fun, I would have my notes app out and I sort of stream of consciousness, note what I like, what I don't like, observe. And you compound that over 10, 15 years, you start to see trends and patterns in cities as different as Amsterdam or Japan or Tokyo or Paris or Cincinnati, right? So I had all these thoughts and I had no one to share them with. And I said, well, I need to make sense of this admittedly scattered amalgam of notes. So I started working through them one by one, uploading them to a Word document, copy and pasting, and just trying to tell a cohesive story. And the first articles I published were basically just those observations. And I had no intention that anybody would ever read them because, and I've told the story once or twice, but it's still worth telling again. I have a very large family and a very supportive family on basically all fronts. But when I published this first article, I sent it out. I have 5 brothers and sisters. I have 20 some odd first cousins. My close-in family, my mom and dad's families, it's some 50 or 60 people. And I'm very blessed that we have such a large,
That's
loving
great.
family. But you send it out to the family group chats and the adulation rolls in. Kobe, this is wonderful. Wow, you've got a knack for this. Sure. But you go online, and the great thing about writing on the internet is you have data. So you can see who read your articles. And I think 2 people read the first article, despite getting dozens of texts from family members at how wonderful it was. So I had no notions that anything I wrote would be received by anyone beyond me and maybe my mom. And even my mom, halfway through the articles, God bless her, there's only so much planning policy you can read.
Yeah.
So the impetus to start writing was because I didn't have a community at that point to talk with. And then the first couple of articles, I didn't have anyone to really share it with. So it was really just about synthesizing my thoughts rather than sharing anything. And strangely enough, I wrote a couple of articles that got a little bit of traction. And I was writing on Medium back then. So there was some virality, I guess, native to the platform that is a little different than Substack today, where a lot of people find themselves writing. And that built some small audience. So on one side, I was doing that. And then on the other, I love Twitter. I maybe that says a lot about me. And I'm not, in the past, I was a much stronger supporter of the platform than maybe now. But I was in all of these various communities, whether it was development or design or architecture or planning, and they were all siloed. I was curious that there was nobody talking about the intersection of design and development when it's sort of, in my mind, the most important part of development. Why do you, obviously it's the impact on the community, but aesthetically, most people's interaction with the structure will just be their cursory experience when they walk by it. Far more people will experience a building walking by it than ever living in it. So obviously both of those things need to be given their due cause. And I just started posting, again, with no intentions whatsoever beyond verbalizing my thoughts. Hey, this is a pretty new building. We should believe that we could do this because look, so-and-so in West Virginia is doing it. So-and-so in Ohio is doing it. So-and-so in Washington State is doing it. And over time, that found its own audience as well. So in parallel path, I was doing writing and I was posting some of these pictures from friends who were doing wonderful projects or more so just people that I admired. And it led to this funny state where, depending on where one has interacted with my work, they either think I'm like a fantastic simpleton that's just, which I'm totally fine with. I think it's really important to broaden the funnel to get people interested in design, where I just go, pretty building good, build these pretty buildings. And then the other side, it's here's 7,000 words on why this novel land use regulation is actually having this disproportionate effect on the way our built environment looks. So it was, it's these funny 2 paths, and neither of them were contrived to generate any level of audience. And even to this day, because of my earliest experiences, I sort of just view myself as posting for me and maybe my mom if she decides to read my text once in a while, and not too many people beyond.
Yeah, that's great. So I want to talk a little bit about just the idea of beauty and the importance of it, because I know that's like a recurring theme in a lot of things that you write about, and it's in your book as well. As you've come to kind of talk about this with others and think about, everybody's like, oh yeah, of course beauty is important. We want to build beautiful things, but why have you come to discuss this so much? And I guess just why do you see it as so important into the work that developers and others pursue?
I think there are 2 tracks that we can take this. One is the aesthetic, and the other is a deeper impact on people's lives. So it is. I don't know if there's a pithy one or two word phrase. The experiential doesn't sound right, but there's two pathways why beauty is important. So one, on the aesthetic, we gravitate towards attractive things, and it should be enough that we should value beauty in its own sake because it improves our lives, the basic enjoyment of our lives. Of course, this isn't an argument that a museum has to make, or a fashion designer has to make, or a furniture designer, or take any of these other disciplines. People innately will see a beautiful work of art, or a dress, or a chair, and say, I like this chair because it's beautiful. But for some reason, architecture in the last century, and I've written about why this is, so it's not a mystery, has eschewed beauty as an orienting imperative. And this would have been very strange to basically any practicing designer prior to 1920 or so. And we know this not only because of the quality of the buildings that have survived, but because of their words. If anyone reads a 19th century or 17th century architectural treatise, among the first words mentioned will be a drive towards delivering and imbuing beauty into the world. So it used to be as simple as, I'm going to design a beautiful piece of art because it's beautiful. I'm going to design a beautiful building because it's beautiful. So that is, I think, what most people think about when they view architecture. And the market knows this. When one travels around the world, you're much more likely to visit Venice than some nondescript suburb of Los Angeles, right? So we know that beauty matters in the aesthetic grounds, but then on this deeper experiential ground, which it's not the right word, but I'll think of it in a little, we can actually measure the impact of attractive places through biometric studies, through surveys, and through market forces. We know that just like being optimistic might give you fewer years on your life, living somewhere with trees will do that. Living somewhere with an appropriate sense of scale, both the horizontal and the vertical will. Living somewhere that has sufficient light and air with proportions that are harmonious with the scale that we've evolved to appreciate. There are deeper sort of primal instincts too in the built environment where we're attracted to places that feel like outdoor rooms because we have a sense of protection, as opposed to walking by an 8-lane highway in Houston or in Phoenix, we feel vulnerable. And when you compound enough of those invulnerating experiences on top of one another, it does deleteriously impact one's life in a way that goes far beyond the simplistic nature of, this is beautiful, we should appreciate it for that on its own grounds. So similar to a lot of my writing and then sharing of beautiful projects, I think there's a dual path importance to beauty in the built environment. Aesthetics for its own sense, which we should all, a lot of people agree that that's important. But then more deeper than that, there are, I would say, existential consequences to how we orient our built environment.
Yeah. That's well said. A lot of that reminds me also of the way former Mayor Joe Riley in Charleston used to talk about beauty and why, really one of the reasons he was such a popular mayor for so long is he pursued beauty in public spaces because it benefits everybody, and it doesn't matter what station you are in life. And I remember one of the more compelling things he talked about, he would tell stories of like people who, born and raised in a place, live their whole life there, never really travel outside of it much. And why it's important for somebody in that station to live in a beautiful place and enjoy the natural beauty and the built environment beauty as well. So one of the pushbacks that I know you hear constantly on all this, and I'm sure you get this question routinely, But it's like, that's all well and good, Kobe. That's great, but beauty's more expensive. The using brick and limestone and other natural materials is more expensive. Taking care to design buildings that have a certain sense of beauty, they just cost more. And so it's a lovely idea, but we can't make the economics work for all of it. So what say you?
I push back strongly. This was sort of the thrust of my talk in KC the other week. It's become the bedrock of a lot of my advocacy that while I do think it's great to have limestone structures, and I love having wonderful church spires find their way on skylines of cities around the world, and that having reproductions of the statue David in our squares would be a wonderful thing. We don't need that to find places beautiful. This is my bias as an urban planner, of course, but I think most of what we perceive as attractive in the built environment comes down to urban design. And I know this is true because in having visited places that are both aesthetically stunning, that were magnificent, like parts of Europe or here where I'm in Brooklyn, very beautiful, as compared to cities where the individual pieces of fabric, like in Seoul or in Tokyo, or even in parts of the US that maybe we mistake for being attractive because of the generosity of their design, like a Charlestown in Boston. Those are rather simple structures. They're not clad in brick. They're clad in wood, they're clapboard, increasingly in cementitious products or in vinyl, that you still feel generally similar. Maybe it feels a little bit better to be walking in Cobble Hill than in Charlestown, but it's not that different. Same in Cambridge. Cambridge is primarily wood-sided homes, and it's magnificent because the scale is right, because the buildings are fine-grained, because there's mixing of uses. Every couple of feet, there's new stimuluses for your brain to take in, and we regard that as attractive because our brains are not getting bored. They're constantly being stimulated. And these things don't cost any money, in fact. To rewrite the regulations of a city to say, instead of a 25-foot front setback, we're going to have a 0 minimum build to line. So you can build all the way up to the property line if you want. You can set back if you want, right? It doesn't cost any money to say, instead of having the windows here, we're going to have bilateral symmetry, which is something that we are innately drawn to. It doesn't cost any money to make sure that the massing and proportions of the building are harmonious with the human form so that when we walk by, we view them as attractive. There are some things that cost a little bit more money. I never lie about this. I'm not going to deceive you and say that stone cladding is actually, in fact, cheaper than brick veneer. It's not, but I don't think we need stone cladding because it's sort of ahistoric to believe that we need that in the first place. We go to a place like Dubrovnik, perhaps, or Santiago in Spain, and these are magnificent stone cities, but that's because there were several centuries of wealth reinvested back into those cores to make them so magnificent. They didn't start with stone, but very small tactical improvements to say we should have surrounds and trim for windows. We should have a little bit of depth to the windows. We should make sure that the front door is a little ornamented so that our eyes are drawn to that as an important focal feature. And if you spend a couple of dollars on a building in this way without cladding it in stone, but just a couple of dollars here and there, I call a tactical investment into these projects, and you line them up next to each other, all of a sudden, a street that without maybe a cornice on every building or these surrounds on the windows can feel very harsh. There's certainly places in Boston, to draw another contrast from Charlestown, that feel rather grim because of this. But if you just invested a couple of thousands of dollars in each structure, you planted some trees on the street, all of a sudden people would flock to that and say, my God, this is an immensely beautiful block. And there's really not that much difference between that and the streets in Cambridge or in Charlestown. This is my pushback to people say that building beautifully is more expensive. I say, of course, you can, there's sort of no upper bound to this. At a certain point, it's all just gold leaf and caviar though. Like it doesn't actually make that much of an improvement, but having the core foundations of a place don't cost any money at all. And then having the little bits of architectural flourish that we appreciate, are marginal. And of course, you can go up from there in cost.
Yeah. Yeah. I often think about like some of the places in the world that we think are the most beautiful, especially like small villages in places that we travel to. You think about Italy, France, even, Mexico. I had a friend who had a wedding in San Miguel de Allende in Mexico, which is a gorgeous little town. When you divorce yourself from the place a little bit and start looking at the actual construction of those buildings, like in San Miguel, those are concrete block buildings with stucco. That's all it is.
That's exactly
one story, a lot of them, or 2 stories. They're very simple. They're maybe in wood frame, wood frame roof. And then they, just like you said, they'll choose to find details in the door surrounds, the doors themselves, the windows and window surrounds themselves. But the buildings are often really simple boxes that are not expensive to construct.
It's absolutely right. And a lot of the beauty of San Miguel comes from the colorfulness of it, which doesn't cost anything.
Exactly.
So you have an orange building next to a purple one, next to a green one, and it feels whimsical, but it's very simple stucco. And a lot of times it's not even the most hard troweled stucco you could have, which is more expensive because you have to go over it a couple times and requires more intense labor. So you could have a float finish that is definitely not as beautiful as a smooth Santa Barbara finish, but it sort of doesn't really matter because everything else is right. This is one thing I wish was a little bit cheaper in the States. If you do your own labor, CMU blocks are a relatively inexpensive form of construction. They're far more inexpensive in Mexico, it's the prevailing mode of construction across the country. But I do think if we had cities where, and this is very common in Latin America, you have 1-story structures as simple as can be. Maybe they're 12 feet tall. So the space feels a little more generous than it might otherwise be. Stucco finish, and then spend $20,000 on the front door.
Yeah.
You would think that is the most beautiful street in America. And in fact, it's actually in aggregate significantly cheaper than I won't name any companies here, but generic tract house that you'd find in suburban Tampa.
Yeah. I mean, I'm a fan of analogies, especially food analogies. And one of the things I always think about is like, Anthony Bourdain and his show, when that was running and he would travel the world, he talked a lot about how some of the best food that we eat and the best cuisines were really born out of very, very humble origins, often born out of poverty, and people really they had to be creative with whatever ingredients they had on hand. And that actually ended up creating some of the most wonderful dishes that we really crave and eat a lot of today. And there's a lot of similarities with architecture. Many of these things that we think of just are gorgeous villages. Think about Greece or, any number of other places. They were really built, out of very humble origins, often by non-professionals and people who were just building with what they had available. And they were kind of copying each other and learning from each other with simple materials and then nice flourishes where they can. And so there really is no reason a lot of this has to be expensive. We've just kind of chosen to make it expensive. So
this is one of the arguments of against globalization that I'm sympathetic to, though broadly I'm not sympathetic to this world, but a view that pushes back on a lot of the prosperity that's been delivered to people around the world over the last century. Is it doesn't make sense that we're getting our lumber from British Columbia and our stone from Italy and our iron parts from Vietnam or China. Yes, it may be cheaper than fashioning the iron in our backyard in Missouri or in New York. And yes, it might be cheaper than us felling the trees in close-in communities. But that sort of mistakes, to your point exactly, Kevin, how these communities were constituted. they were built of the materials around them. So these villas in Greece or in North Africa were built of the clay that came from the earth around them. And they were whitewashed so that you reflected the sun, because it's very intense in these regimes or in these places. And similar in Northern Europe, we have these really charming wood-framed homes. That's because there are old-growth forests nearby. And in England, there's a lot of brick homes because there was very rich clay. So we've gone away from that in this drive towards hyper efficiency. And in the aggregate, it is probably true that if you're doing some thousands of units a year, it makes sense for you to bring in 2x4s from Western Canada, or, there are obviously large forests in the US and Arkansas and in Washington State and in Georgia. But I think we need to step back another level. And unfortunately, that change won't come about until there are local ecosystems that can support that, which have unfortunately been obviated from some of these systems of global production.
Yeah. So I do want to talk a little bit about what you're up to now. And you have a project, I believe, in Kingston, New York, that you're pursuing. So let's talk about what you're trying to achieve with your next phase of development work, and maybe even how you're trying to integrate some of these ideas into your own development projects.
The reason we're building in Kingston in the first place is because the city has passed a set of land use regulations that are in lockstep with all that we've talked about today. I joke with people that it's a sandbox for developers. I mean, it really is. There's no parking minimums. There's no front setbacks. They have actually minimum street frontages. So it's pushing one to embrace the street in a way that most cities are at best indifferent to in their codes, but mostly they're hostile towards. And there's a number of other code provisions that make it easy to build there. It's also relatively close to the city. And you couldn't find two cities that are more at odds with the permissiveness of development than New York City and Kingston. For the size of Kingston, I'd far rather develop there than in New York, regardless of whatever opportunity there might be here. It's not opportune for me. So in Kingston, what we're trying to prove is that through really lovely infill projects, but by no means opulent, we can stitch together the fabric of a really beautiful city and incrementally expand it outwards so that it grows in smart ways, as opposed to going and felling 30 acres of forest just outside of the city. There are opportunities to look at lots that maybe would have been neglected for these sorts of interventions previously. So our first project there is on Frog Alley. It's a 40-unit infill quasi-townhome development. We're taking inspiration from Dutch hofjes, so Dutch cottage courts. And the reason we're doing this is because Kingston is a Dutch city. Historically, it was originally Native American, but the first European settlers were Dutch, and that history courses through the city to this day. So we took inspiration not only from our immediate context, but also from the context that the city was founded in. And this has been met very favorably by our neighbors and by public officials in Kingston, because we care a lot about the history of the city, and to not be historicist, to take cues from the past and then try to push forward in incremental ways. We have a couple of retail units there, which will be very small by design. We don't want large chains. I want a space where some young girl or guy can launch whatever concept they might have in their mind and not have to worry about spending so much on rent or having to merchandise a very large space. We have, I think, very attractive houses, but they're, again, no means opulent. They are at human scale between 1 and 3 stories. We're going to likely be cladding them in pine or in a hardy product that is very durable and functionally indistinguishable from a wood. And we will, I think we spent much time with Thomas Doherty, who's just a magnificent urban planner and an architect. He's a Notre Dame guy and now practices outside of Philly, thinking about the spatial dimensions of the courtyards and how people will feel moving through these. And our hope is not that when people walk by this, they say, let's prostrate in front of it and give praise to the developers and architects who design it, but that they can say, this is a bit of city that I like. I maybe take my dog down the street when I wouldn't have otherwise done so because it was a big vacant lot that was sort of overgrown. It is a really nice addition to the city. And over time, if in Kingston opportunities arise, which some have, and we're underwriting them now, to continue to stitch together this already really good fabric and add a couple more pieces of thread there, so that when one walks through, they get a comprehensive feeling that the city is really wonderful, we'll have done a good job. And to your point earlier about Mayor Riley in Charleston, this is exactly what happened in Charleston 40 years ago. It's obviously a little bit bigger than Kingston with a little bit deeper history, but 40 years ago, it's not like Charleston had half a million people. It was 70, 80,000 people. So it wasn't that big of a city. We now only in retrospect view Charleston's success as predetermined in some way because of all of the hard work that Mayor Riley and the wonderful developers and designers who I revere deeply, folks like Vince Graham and Jeff Graham and their father Tom and Andrew Gould on the design side and Reed Burgess and Christopher Libertos, on and on and on. Yeah. There's so many wonderful practitioners, but each of them individually just took their little bit. Vince did a larger project, but most of these designers and developers took little pieces of fabric, did fundamentally good or really good buildings, but by no means monumental. Over 40 years, it's amazing the impact that can have on a city. And we hope to do the same in our small way in Kingston.
That's really great. Would these initial 40 unit project, will that be a rental community? Will you sell? Okay.
It'll all be rental. And there's a few reasons for that. One, I think we're going to add a lot of value to the city, and we don't necessarily want to give up on that. But we also view ourselves as stewards. So if we can shepherd this asset for the next 10, 15, 20 years, God willing, we can hold on to it, then we'll be able to further this mission. And by building this portfolio of assets up, as the tide of the city rises, so too will our projects, we hope. So I like rental because it gives you a stake in the community, as opposed to for sale. You're sort of, there's deep pride that one can take from it, but there's a different relationship. And also the market doesn't really support for sale product because the replacement cost is so near to the valuation of a finished property.
Where are you in the process right now, the various stages you go through?
Hopefully receiving approvals very, very shortly. We've had some delays, which, as you know intimately well, happens on every project. But the city has been our greatest champion. The planning board, the mayor's office, the Office of Housing Initiatives, one by one, we couldn't ask for a better city to work with. There have been some hiccups on, let's say, the consulting side for us, which again happen. There's coordination and timing constraints that all consultants are subject to. So we hope to be receiving approvals and then closing our financing in the next couple of months. And if we get a shovel in the ground by end of summer, maybe fall, that'd be wonderful. But like with all these things, we'll see.
How did the capital raise portion go for you?
So we're fully raised, which is great, based off of the loan that we've secured from the state. So I should note that this is going to be 100% affordable housing, no LIHTC. So there's no tax credits that are going to be involved. It's all lowercase a affordable housing. So we're deed restricting them, but not taking public tax credits to finance it. And that the program we're using in New York State offers us higher overall debt at a very attractive interest rate in exchange for us deed restricting all these units at affordable rates. So there are wonderful programs that have been developed nationwide for, let's say, this public and private engagement to deliver deeply needed affordable housing that I would suggest listeners to look into, because you might not be aware these programs have passed. They very often housing and finance departments at the state level don't have great PR machines. And so they pass all this wonderful legislation and create these really wonderful programs, and nobody uses them. So we're making use of a program in New York State that allows us to push the leverage, which means we didn't have to raise as much equity. And as our mission here is a little more novel, it's definitely not your standard 5/1, your standard tract house. It was really important for us because we didn't have to stick our necks out as far as we might have. And once this is finished, my hope is we can then go replicate it several more times.
Great. That's great. Well, I look forward to reading and seeing more about it. That's super exciting. It's always exciting when you get to the point where you finally do a groundbreaking. So hopefully we hear more about that this summer. So Kobe also has a Substack that goes by Building Optimism as well, which will you do updates on the Substack about the progress of the project?
I will, though progress updates on development are rather dissatisfying because they don't come that frequently.
I know.
It's that. So to the extent that there are things to share, I'm very happy to share the updates, and I will. We've just been in a holding pattern.
Yeah, understood. Well, Kobe, this has been great. If anybody wants to follow along beyond the Substack, what do you recommend for where to engage with you?
I'm still posting pretty pictures on Twitter at Kobe Lefko. And other than that, Substack and Twitter are pretty much the two platforms that I'm on.
Great. Well, I can't wait to see how things progress. I really appreciated what all you've shared and enjoyed your presentation in Kansas City, and hope to see more of you as time goes on. So this was really, really great. Thank you, Kobe.
Likewise. And Kevin, thank you so much, man. It was so great to sit down and talk with you here, and look forward to keeping all these conversations going.
Absolutely. Let's do it. All right, Kobe Lefkowitz, ladies and gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us.